Welcome back. We're glad to see everybody made it. I knew this was being a good conference because as I went to leave my hotel room this morning, I noticed I had my shirt on inside out. So New Orleans is doing its magic. We've got a good agenda again this morning. We're going to get started right off the bat. First person up this morning is Cynthia Quarterman, who's the administrator of the Pipelines and Hazardous Material Safety Administration. We're thrilled to have the administrator here this morning. She was here last year also. She's going to talk to us. You know, they're on the receiving end every time there's an accident somewhere around the country. They have to respond to it, and often they somehow get blamed for it, even though they're not really PHMSA's pipelines. I've had the pleasure of meeting Cynthia a number of times, even had the pleasure of, because of a variety of weird logistics, riding in a van with her on the way to a congressional hearing and seeing all her government affairs people trying to tell her different things in different ears about what somebody may ask her. And I thought, oh boy, I'm glad I don't have that many governmental affairs people. And then watching, congressional people ask her questions about things she has no jurisdiction over and how you answer those types of things. So we're thrilled to have her this morning, and I'm going to just let her get at it. I think everybody knows Cynthia. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone. I will be singing this song all day. Thank you for having me here in beautiful New Orleans. I have to say I've never been to New Orleans with the weather like this before. It certainly is a lot cooler and nicer here than it is on the Hill. Testifying at many hearings with my friend and compatriot Carl Weimer. Thank you to him and to the Pipeline Safety Trust Board for inviting me here again to speak this year. I'd also like to send regards and regrets from Secretary LaHood, who was unable to join us today here at this meeting. I will tell you what he says in a nutshell everywhere he goes, and what he says both in public and private: safety is our number one priority, period, full stop, and he means that. So whenever you have a meeting with him, it's pretty simple. Okay, what should we be doing from a safety perspective? And that's the way things go. Last year when I spoke, one of the things I talked about was the mission of the Pipeline Safety Trust. I had the opportunity to read through some of the materials, and I mentioned then that it occurred to me that in many ways the mission of the Pipeline Safety Trust and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration are both overlapping and intertwined. I have since adapted that footing just a little bit, and it was based on the experience here last night and last year and over the past several years. You know, every year or so we do within the administration or within all of government an employee survey about what are their views about the organization and what they do. And I would have to say the number one vote from everyone, that everybody agrees with, the highest ranking, is their commitment to the mission of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, that they are solely and truly focused on improving pipeline safety in this country. For them, it's a vocation, a choice that they have made. And I was thinking last night, this organization is different in that not everybody in this room, and many people are not here because of a choice that they made, but rather a stroke of destiny that happened. Or as Bruce would say, being at the right place in the wrong time. I have to say thank you so much to Bruce for sharing his and Marlene's story last night about Liam. And for those of you yesterday who spoke during the meeting, I was not able to attend, but I did hear some feedback about that, about your reason for being involved with the Pipeline Safety Trust. I'd like to say on behalf of myself, PHMSA, the administration, and the public in general, thank you so much for your commitment to pipeline safety. I know for many of you it's a difficult calling, a calling that was not a choice for you, but one that it was inspired for other reasons. And I'd like to think that the stories that we heard yesterday, we will all think that Liam and others like him and families and friends who had other effects for the spills over the past decade and beyond, that the suffering that they have would not be in vain because of your efforts and the efforts of PHMSA to improve pipeline safety. I also want to say hello and a shout out to Mayor Pawlowski, excuse me if I butchered that, and to Mayor Ruan, who I had the opportunity to meet along the way over the past year or so. It's interesting, when I started this job, one of the top things on our agenda was pipeline safety reauthorization. And during my first 6 months or so, I met with all the different constituents, industry, Pipeline Safety Trust, the states, NAPSTR, everyone, and I think everybody was joined in the notion that, the past 10 years had been good with respect to pipeline safety trust, pipeline safety, that we were way beyond where we had been a decade ago in terms of improving pipeline safety and on the right course, and that when reauthorization came around, there would not be any big issues or initiatives going forward, that we would stay the course. And then, bam, 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 incident after incident after incident occurred. And the first incident that was of national significance, I think, which really got people's attention, occurred in Marshall, Michigan. At the time, I had to sit on the sidelines and watch as everybody else responded, but one of the things that gave me the opportunity to do was to read all the press accounts and all of everything that was happening, going on from a distance, and begin to think about, okay, how can we chart our course forward? We had already drafted a piece of legislation on behalf of the administration, and if you know anything about this administration, you know that it's not very often that pieces of legislation have been put forward. This is one that we had in our hip pocket and took the opportunity to put out immediately after the first incident occurred. And I began to think about, so what are the common threads, the issues that I see and am concerned about, the questions that I have, and that led to our first advance notice of proposed rulemaking with respect to hazardous liquid pipelines. Some of the questions we asked with respect to that rulemaking was, have we defined a high consequence area adequately? And this really rose up as a result of, the initial response and people saying, well, is this a high consequence area or isn't it? And I thought to myself, why don't we know the answer to that question? Another thing that we asked was, should we even have high consequence areas anymore? Should we expand the integrity management priorities beyond high consequence areas? Another question that immediately came to mind was, okay, shouldn't we have leak detection? Why was it that so much oil spilled and nobody knew about it? So there were a series of sort of, I thought, simplistic but apparent questions that needed to be asked and that we need to have a conversation about. And I also thought, well, we shouldn't just be having this conversation about hazardous liquid. We should be having it about gas transmission pipelines. That's a little further behind in terms of when the integrity management rules were put in place, but it is becoming more mature, and maybe a year from now we can do that. And sure enough, like that, San Bruno happened. And many of the questions that were raised in the hazardous liquid context were ready to be repeated in that arena, as well as several more questions that I did not even know need to be answered about, for example, the use of ECDA, direct assessment, as one of the assessment measures, or grandfathering pipe provisions that were in in the regulations in the past, and a series of other questions that were raised internally about that particular rulemaking. And so we now have pending an ANPRM asking those questions on the gas transmission side. But that wasn't enough. In February, there was an incident that occurred in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And again, questions from the past came up. And at this point, the Secretary and I had a conversation about, the big incidents that are happening very close to where people live, obviously, in the states. And, Congress, in its wisdom, decided that the federal government should give to the states, if they wanted it, authority over these pipelines, since they had been regulating them long before there was federal regulations. But we feel a responsibility for all the pipelines in this country. And one of the things that the Secretary often says is that he didn't realize what a patchwork there was in terms of regulatory issues. And we decided to issue a call up to action. And that's really to bring together all the constituents beyond the usual players, everybody who has a dog in this fight, to come together and talk about how we might go beyond what our really legislative and regulatory authorities are, and talk about how can we accelerate the replacement, the removal, the reformation of some of these pipelines that have been in place for many, many years. How can we, all stakeholders working together, do that? And for those of you who may not know what the other stakeholders are, there are many. We met with the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission because they have authority over siting of new gas pipelines. We don't share in that authority, so we only work as a cooperating agency. They have the final authority on that. We talked with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the reason for that is that many of the pipelines that are closest to people, the gas distribution pipelines, are being regulated by these entities in terms of both pipeline safety, which is represented by the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives, NAPSR, but also by NARUC in terms of rates. In order to be able to make a big difference in replacement of pipelines or any major initiatives to update these pipelines, those costs get put into rates that are paid for by the ratepayers. And the NARUC commissioners have to be involved in agreeing that pipeline safety is a high priority for us all. And so there were many other organizations, obviously the industry organizations that we met with, to talk about, okay, how can we all work together to achieve this goal? And over the past several months, we've been receiving information from all those organizations, and we have created a new website that tries to put all that information together in one place. I would ask if the Pipeline Safety Trust would also send in a letter with their ideas and thoughts about how we might pursue this. We had a meeting in Washington in April where we had a large group of people coming together talking about what are the challenges we face and how might we deal with them going forward in the future. I think that was a great meeting, probably not the last of its kind. We have been drafting, with the help of Carl Weimer, who served on the joint subcommittee of our two advisory committees, what we're calling a report to America. And that report is really to America, trying to make as simple as possible what is not a very simple issue, which is pipeline safety and how these things work, and just to let them know what has been happening in the past. And the subcommittee came up with some ideas and potential initiatives going forward. And you will see that in the next few months. I regret that it hasn't come out already, but we're still working through that. We are also planning in December, next month, December 9th, in Washington, the Secretary will host with the U.S. Fire Association and NAPSR a meeting on emergency response. I think one of the things that we heard a time and time again from these different incidents was the absence of complete or good knowledge by the local responders about the pipelines in their areas and what to do in case of an incident and that sort of thing. And we want to bring them together to give us a sense of what it is they need, how they need it, and once we have that information, I think we'll be able to march forward in a much better way. We've already put out a safety advisory related to emergency response, but that's only, the first step along the way. The period between, I think, July of 2010 and July of 2011 has, probably been the worst time for pipeline safety in more than a decade in terms of the number and the size of incidents that have occurred, the incidents with high consequences. And, I think we have to use this and find the silver lining in this cloud in order to be able to make continual improvements to the pipeline safety program over the next few years. Certainly that's my goal, and I know it's a goal that I share with all of you in this room. I also wanted to touch on some of the items that the Pipeline Safety Trust during one of the many hearings, I think there were 15 over the past couple of years, that have happened with respect to pipeline safety. Some of the issues that were raised by this group as things to be top of mind in terms of improving pipeline safety. One of those I've touched on a little bit, expanding integrity management protection, and that is something that is the subject of two advance notice of proposed rulemakings, one on hazardous liquids where we've gotten comments in, and we are working on a notice for proposed rulemaking that will hopefully come out early next year. We are still in the comment period on the gas transmission rule, but those are questions that are asked there and things that we are considering. Leak detection systems is another. That was also raised within the context of the hazardous liquid ANPRM, and one where we plan to have a meeting early next year to talk further about how we might attain the goal of getting better leak detection systems, as well as issues related to automatic and remotely controlled shutoff valves. We want to do all that early next year. You will see very soon one of the other issues that was raised was excess flow valves. You'll see within the next week or two an advanced proposed rulemaking coming out from us with respect to expanding those requirements beyond residential residences. Damage prevention program, something that has been of great interest to the Secretary and to myself. We have tried to push as hard as we could the 811 banner. We're going to be pushing even harder coming in the next year. We are also working on a notice of proposed rulemaking with respect to damage prevention in terms of third-party damage to pipelines. That still remains a huge problem. It seems like over the past couple of months, many of the incidents that have occurred that have affected and taken lives have been associated with excavation damage, and it's always been a hot issue and one that we will continue to be focused on. Technical assistance grants, this is one where we are happy to provide funding to this organization and others that are interested in getting more knowledge locally about pipeline safety. We have attempted over the past year to try to get more communities involved in vying for those grants, and also trying to steer them towards working on the pipeline and the PIPA initiative so that they can start thinking about pipelines in their communities before buildings happen, before they build communities, very close to pipelines. We think that's very important. Making public information available. I heard that there was a great slide yesterday that Carl put up that showed that we were at the top of the list in terms of transparency. We want to raise the bar on that even higher if we can. We have coming out very shortly what we're calling a community toolbox that will provide even more information that's tied in directly to stakeholders. That I think has been long overdue, which is try to clean up our website. It's been a personal thorn in my side to not be able to find anything on our website. We are starting in later on, before the end of the year, we're going to be putting up a new front page to the website, and then we're going to begin cascading through to make it simpler and cleaner. You know, every time I go up there, it's like a big laundry list to me. I don't know how anybody uses it. I think it's important to make sure that everything is much more easily available to people. Public awareness, we are in the midst of doing many public awareness inspections along with our state partners. We plan to get all those completed by the end of next year. That's one of our top initiatives. And there are, as Jeff Weiss will surely tell you, a number of other initiatives that we have ongoing on our plate. I mean, we really are using this as an opportunity to refresh the pipeline safety program and try to use this opportunity to clean up some things that have been long-standing issues, but there was no political will to get them done. And now that there is, we'd like to snatch hold of that opportunity and do so. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you once again for all of your personal commitment to this effort. Last year, I think it was a much smaller crowd, Carl. I guess I'm part glad, part sad to have that happen here today. But if we have more people involved with us in helping to improve pipeline safety, I think that's a good thing overall. And I'd be happy to answer any questions the audience might have. You take them over there, yeah. Sure.
So we do have 5 or more minutes for questions, and I see some hands up. I don't have the microphone up here, so let me steal this one. If you're way in the back and can meet me halfway, we can fit in more questions.
Thank you very much for coming to our conference. I'm Carol Parker. I'm one of the board members of the Pipeline Safety Trust. And speaking for myself, when I heard you speak about the report to America, I know I was pretty disappointed in some of the early drafts of that. And I want to ask you, is it possible that the report to America can focus more on some of the questions you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that struck you? Because I think those are the same questions that are really striking Americans. Why? What is it going to take that we don't have leak detection that can find a spill before Marshall, Michigan happens? You know, what's it going to take so that Allentown isn't springing leaks like a sprinkler on a July day? What's it going to take to have adequate regulations, and is there a commitment on the part of this administration to get there? I think I would encourage you to reach back to those questions you had early on and refocus that report so that it really grapples with the really hard questions. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. And let me just say, I think it was extremely unfortunate that an early draft of that report was sent out beyond the members of the committee and beyond the administration and taken to the public and torn apart as though it were a final document when it was not. I think one of the things that we made clear when we asked the subcommittee and the two committees to come together to help us in beginning the draft of that report was that that's what it was, a draft, and that ultimately it would be the Secretary's report, and the final report that comes out from the administration would be the report. Going back to the content of the report, the real purpose of it was to set the stage for and educate the public about pipeline safety and what happens there. We have not attempted to raise questions that we can't necessarily answer at this point. I mean, that's part of what the rulemaking process is about, being able to ask those questions and to begin to formulate an answer. And that's what the report will do. It will tell the public where we are, what things we need to do in the future to move forward on pipeline safety.
Other questions? Oh, come on. How often do you get this chance?
I guess I have two questions. First, as being an impacted resident from Marshall, Michigan, we're very interested in getting more information regarding the hearing on December 9th about safety and first responders. So if we can get more information about that, we are very interested in getting information for our hometown. So if that's available. And then also corrective action orders. I've noticed through the history of the pipeline spill in our hometown that they're unenforced. Is there any way to address those problems where corrective action orders aren't pursued and aren't followed through with?
I'm unfamiliar with them being unenforced, so if you have a specific, if we send out a corrective action order before it can be withdrawn, the parties have to live up to the requirements in that order. If there are certain provisions that you think have not been enforced, we would like to know about that. In terms of the meeting in December, there is information on our website. If you give me a card, we will get you further information about when it's going to be, what's going to be happening. We'd love to have you there.
Other questions?
I'm Ziad Saad. I'm with the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. Obviously, everything that happens south of the border affects north of the border, and we're very much in a similar environment up in Canada as you are here in the U.S. And my question is, we heard yesterday from Mr. Christopher Hart, the Deputy Chair from the NTSB, and he was quoting from his experience in the aviation industry. And what struck me is how enthusiastic he was about and how proud he was of all the gains that were achieved in the aviation industry without necessarily resorting to more stringent regulations through deep, deep collaboration between all the parties. And my question is, are we going to always, is that a context that is applicable to the pipeline industry, I guess, from a regulator's point of view? And do you think the public can support advancement without necessarily adding more and more regulations? Some regulation, modification, and enhancement is necessary. I understand that, but as a concept.
Thank you for your question. That's a good question. I think that there has to be a symbiotic relationship between prescriptive regs and more performance-based measures. I mean, as you may know, when the Integrity Management Program was put in place, there were prescriptive regs on the books, and those continue to exist. The notion of the performance-based measures is that not only will people simply do what is in the regs, but they will go beyond what is in the regs and really commit to thinking about their systems, commit to looking at where their pipelines run, what is the environment there, what are the risks associated with being in that environment, what kind of materials do they have in their pipeline, what kind of cathodic protection system do they have, what has history shown. Obviously, they need to know their pipeline before they can make that assessment. If they don't know their pipeline well, they need to be extremely conservative about the choices that are made. So I think there's a role for both of those, but in order to really get the effect that we want to have on the performance-based regs, we really have to have an ongoing and serious and commitment from the industries we regulate that they will internalize the notion of performance-based regulations, and that they will really take a unjaundiced view of what is required, that they will take a clean slate and say, okay, this is my system, here are the true things, and not look at it and say, okay, here is the performance-based regs, what's the least common denominator, what can I get away with here? And that's where I think we have difficulties, and the public has difficulties if they see instances where somebody is not living up to the requirements that performance-based regs put in place. And when we see that, we need to go back and ensure that, if necessary, if there are more prescriptive regs that have to be put in place in order to get the kind of performance that we want, then we will do that. So I think it's a two-sided thing. I mean, we cannot regulate safety culture. We can encourage it, and we can ask companies to do it, but ultimately they have to internalize that.
Great, thank you. We really appreciate you being here today and taking questions, and we hope this collaboration continues and PHMSA moves up and is on the top of all the lists we show from now on. We're going to move on to our next session. Let's have a round of applause for the administrator for being here this day.